If you aren't familiar with the One Night Ultimate Vampire series, or the Vampire team, make sure to check out my tutorial up above about One Night Ultimate Vampire.
Obvious here, back at it again with another video. This time I'm going to be going through the One Night Ultimate series, and more specifically, strategizing with each of the teams to give you an idea of what kind of things that you should be looking for, and from my personal experience, what kind of things that other players are going to try to do on the Vampire team. So to give you an overview before we even start, to remind you about the Vampire team, we have the Renfield, the Count, the Vampire, and the Master. If you remember back when I talked about the overview of how the night runs inside of One Night Ultimate Vampire, I mentioned that the Count, the Vampire, and the Master are all the vampires who are all going to wake up and know who each other are. Now, from the perspective of the each individual roles, they're not going to necessarily know which is which. If you're a vampire, you're going to not necessarily know who is the Count and who is the Master. And the same could be said for any of the other two roles, but you all know that you're the vampires, and you've done what you can to turn somebody else into a vampire. The key thing with the team from an overall perspective is that outside of epic battles, you're not really going to use a whole lot of them. Simply because of the fact that they already by themselves have the ability to turn somebody else into a vampire as well. And if you have like a low player count, say 2-3 players, say maybe even like 4, then it's really difficult for the village team to do anything if you have 2 vampires in play, because then you make pretty much every time the majority of players vampires. So that's something to keep in mind. And then of course, after the vampires wake up and gives somebody pretty much biting them, then from an overview perspective, we have the Count, who will then wake up afterwards and will put the Mark of Fear on somebody. Remember, if you remember back what the marks do, the Mark of Fear takes away any character's ability who wakes up at night in order to do so, because it makes them too terrified to do anything. And the Renfield is basically the minion of the vampire team. And he gives himself the mark of the bat to pretty much clear himself from being a vampire in the case that he accidentally gets bitten by the rest of the vampires. But when the Renfield wakes up, the Count, the Vampire, and the Master will still be pointing at who they bit. So when the Renfield wakes up, he's going to see the pointing fingers and knows that those are his vampires that he's trying to protect. But now, I'm going to go in a bit detail of the sort of strategy that you want to go with each of the individual characters. So if you are the vampire here, this is just a good shot of the first character that we're going to talk about. If you were simply just the vampire, then you kind of have less information to go off of in comparison, and kind of have less strategy. Granted, as any minority team member, your goal is going to be to try to bluff as a different character to throw away suspicion from yourself. The problem is, in comparison to the other roles inside of One Night Ultimate Werewolf or even One Night Ultimate Werewolf Daybreak, is that you have that second layer of marks, and you have characters that you want to look out for. You know who your initial vampire team is, but it's hard to coordinate with your team pretty much on what roles are which, and to not only deduce what those other roles are, but the best way to use their powers. So remember, there's a good chance, 50-50 wise, that when you're starting out as a vampire, and you're turning somebody else into a vampire, that you gotta watch out for the priest. Because the priest has a 50-50 chance of that person that you turn into a vampire is no longer a vampire. So if you manage to secretly communicate with that player that, hey, I turned you into a vampire, we're on the same team in some way, then not only is it going to be a problem because they might no longer be a vampire and you might have just outed yourself to that player, but then now the rest of the group sees, oh, there's this conversation going on. Are they on the same team? What's happening? What's going on? So you're putting more suspicion on yourself. I'd say some good roles to bluff as a vampire would probably be between any of the roles that add a mark, and that would have to be a single mark. So the assassin could be a good bluff, the apprentice assassin could be a good bluff, and the diseased could be a good bluff, as well as the instigator, because they each put down one mark. So in a way, if you're coming up with a story on how I'm the instigator, I put the mark of the traitor down on somebody, then it's technically true that you put a mark down. It's just that you're lying about if you're the instigator or not. And if you're able to come up with a story and you're able to sneak away to where you can get people to collaborate your story, then it oftentimes might put your word against the player who might actually be that role. Of course, it's even better if that role isn't even in play to begin with, so that there's no doubt in that person's mind that that's the role that you say you are. Because unlike One Night Ultimate Werewolf, there's not very many roles that can confirm or deny your story. There's no seer that can look in the middle that can for sure see that this vampire is lying because I saw this character in the middle. The only one who gets slight insight into that is the copycat. But even then, the copycat becomes the role that he sees. So it's kind of 50-50. So like if any of your vampires that are on your team are in the middle, and you're just a lone vampire by yourself, and the copycat sees a vampire, then the copycat's on your team. So the copycat can corroborate your story, even if nobody knows that you were the copycat originally. So it's a bit tricky with the vampires as far as coming up with your bluffs, because you can pretty much the only bluff route that you have isn't necessarily what you do with the cards. It can also be your bluff route through the marks. So you could say, I'm the instigator, I put the traitor on somebody. You could say, I'm the diseased, don't vote for me. And then I put the mark of the disease on this person, so don't vote for them. It could be a way to cover somebody's tail or cover one of your own people as well. It's a bluffing strategy that may or may not work depending on the group that you're with. Honestly, the one thing that you got to watch out for as a vampire, especially when you introduce bonus rolls and any other rolls, is that while the diseased is a great claim, as it makes you less likely to be voted for at the very end, the thing oftentimes will try to bait a vampire. Or in One Night Ultimate Daybreak, it would try to bait an alpha wolf. Because they have their ways of tapping one person on the shoulder, which kind of verifies that they're that role. There's no way to hide that you're the thing. Like there is a way to hide other roles and try to bait the minority teams into claiming those roles when you have information that you would reveal later that would contradict what that person was saying. So, honestly, this strategy can go towards the count as well. So pretty much all the strategies that I have for you here inside of vampires also works with the realms of the count. Now, when it comes to the count, most of the strategy when it comes to the count is pretty straightforward. Reminding you of the count and its abilities, the count will wake up alongside the vampire and the master, and will choose a player who's going to be bitten and turned into a fourth vampire, essentially. Pretty much similarly to the vampire from earlier, the count is going to have a lot of trouble with a 50-50 decision on who the vampire is and who the master is. And it's going to be important, especially when I go towards the master. But the count has a very interesting thing when it comes to his strategy. So a lot of the times, when it comes to the villagers, who are oftentimes going to have most of their information be public, they're not going to really try to hide anything. As most cases with any One Night Ultimate game, you're going to want your villagers to have the majority, and your vampires be the minority. to where it's harder to pinpoint them. But the thing is that a lot of the times with the way that the Count's Mark of Fear works is that when all the players wake up and they get the Mark of Fear, they're going to know that the Count is in play every single time. They're going to know that somebody out there is the Count, even if they don't know specifically who is who. Whereas with the vampires, you could just say with the Mark of the Vampire that it could be the vampire, it could be the master, it could be the Count, but there's no certainty as to which is which. So you put the villagers a little bit more on their toes in that case. But with the Count specifically, the player who wakes up and says, hey, I have the Mark of Fear on me, I couldn't wake up last night and do anything, that immediately points suspicion of, okay, somebody over here is the Count. The best claim that you can do in order to kind of cover your tail and to kind of create a story out of it is one of two things. You can either, like the vampire, claim to be the diseased to try to avoid suspicion, but that's not the strongest case. As if you're trying to throw suspicion and be like, hey, don't vote for me, hey, don't vote for me, then that honestly just makes you even look more guilty in comparison to before. Whereas, as my second and best choice for the Count is if you pick the gremlin. Because if you say that you were the gremlin and that you didn't get the Mark of Fear, you could say that you switched that person's mark with somebody else's mark. So even though initially it would be true that when they woke up they saw the Mark of Fear, you could say that it's no longer on them and that you weren't the one who placed it there. It's a really good cover to have for yourself as the Count. I'd say aside from the gremlin, you could also, if you've convinced one person that if you convince somebody that you are the gremlin, that you switch marks, and you can convince a marksman to vouch for your story, because the marksman has the ability to look at a mark of one player and a card of another player. Depending on who they look at, and if you're careful, you can convince the marksman to actually vouch for your story and dissuade the whole town from voting for you or for that specific player. Because then at that point, it makes it look like you're incriminating the player who said that they had the Mark of Fear, so they didn't do anything, and that it's not true. So it's a very sneaky strategy to come up with a Count. But you got to be really careful, and you got to be able to read what roles you think are or are not in the game based on the information that the villagers come out with, because you're always looking for that angle. Because pretty much in any social deduction game, and especially in the One Eye Ultimate series, you're going to have people who are more secretive with the roles and are only going to reveal information to try to catch any of the minority teams in a lie. Or you're going to have those that come out with information early to, one, help the villagers deduce who is who, but two, it could also be your lead into how you're going to be able to manipulate that lie to where you're using truths to take advantage of the situation. So yes, you did in fact wake up with the Mark of Fear. I believe that you woke up with the Mark of Fear. However, I was the gremlin. I didn't have the Mark of Fear. So I swapped your mark with this person's mark, so you don't have it anymore. It's a lot harder to argue with somebody if you agree with them. So it could be suspicious, it could be a suspicious play, but if you play it right and you get the right roles on the village team to vouch for you, you can make it work. Now we got a very fun and interesting role in comparison to everybody else who's on the vampire team. We have the Master. So if you don't remember what the Master does, and the way that it formats to kind of put yourself in the mindset of how you're going to be thinking as the Master, is that the Master is going to wake up towards the beginning of the dusk phase, at the same time as the Count and the Vampire, to recognize who is on the same team. Once that has been determined, then all three vampires are going to decide as a group who it is that they're going to bite and turn into a fourth vampire on their team.
At that point, the master will never wake up again. He will pretty much be closing his eyes the entire time, only to wake up to maybe look at his mark. But other than that, he's going to be asleep the entire time. However, the key thing that the village team is going to be looking out for, in comparison to everybody else, is the way that the master influences the voting power of the group. Because if the master has the majority of the votes when execution comes, and at least one vampire points at the master, then all of those votes get negated and it goes to the second most person to be killed. Which is huge, because you could be leading in the total right direction. The villagers could be totally right because the master is a vampire. But because the master 90% of the time can't be killed, it's a wasted vote. So instead of trying to remain hidden and to use all these bluffs to kind of manipulate your way and to convince other people towards getting killed, you sort of have to do the opposite. You want to hide the fact that you're the master, of course, because you don't want people to suspect that you are and not vote for you. But you also can't be willy-nilly suspicious, if that makes any sense. So you want the people to vote for you, which is totally the opposite of what you were originally going for. So how can you really do that? Well, it's really going to be leaning on your other vampires, for starters. If you can convince the Count and the vampire to secretly communicate to them that you're the master, then the Count and the vampire in their minds, and maybe even the turned vampire, can think and be like, okay, with what we know and with what we've claimed so far in our stories, how can we use our information to throw suspicion onto the master? To where if even there's this one guy who's just been ragging on, like, no, this isn't true, it's this guy, it has to be this guy is causing stories, causing chaos. Well, then the vampires got to be a little bit on their toes. They got to be thinking, okay, how can we convince this one guy to instead go after the sponge that is the master and not go after the Count or the regular vampire? So I would say that as the master, roles such as the assassin, maybe even the copycat, would be good roles to claim to be. Because the copycat becomes the role that he sees in the center that isn't in the game, which nobody could argue. But the thing is, with the assassin, if you play a sloppy assassin game, then they're not going to kill that target. And just as a future reference, the assassin can't win if he's dead. Especially if the apprentice assassin's in play, because the apprentice assassin wants the assassin to die. And if that happens, then the assassin can't win, and the mark can't be fulfilled. So that could be an option for you. You could go the assassin angle who plays poorly, so people are trying to vote you out and make sure that your target doesn't work. You could also go with the diseased route to make yourself look more suspicious. You could be like, I'm the disease, please don't vote for me. I gave this person the mark, don't vote for them. Therefore, it causes suspicion on you of like, okay, he's backpedaling now. I think we really got a vampire this time. So, you have a very interesting job in comparison to before. So, even though there's less as far as hiding because you're not trying to hide as the master, leave your comments down below. Is there any strategies that you guys can think of as far as what you should do as the master? I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. So now we have the Renfield, essentially the minion of the vampire team. So, if you don't remember, as far as overview of the Dusk Phase, vampires are all going to wake up at the same time. They're going to know who each other are. The Renfield is not a vampire, so you're not going to wake up at the same time. The Count, the Vampire, the Master are then going to collectively decide who they're going to turn into their fourth vampire. Hopefully it isn't you, because you're on their team. But if it is, you have the mark of the bat to take care of that. Once the vampires have decided who their target is going to be, the count will wake up afterwards and will put somebody under the mark of fear. After that, then the Renfield will wake up. Of course, all the vampires will have their eyes closed, but the vampires will be pointing at who they turn into their fourth vampire. This is crucial base level strategy for the Renfield to know. Yes, you are on the vampire team. However, the vampires don't know who you are. So, you got to be able to either one of two things has got to happen. One, secretly coordinate with your vampires to let them know that you're the Renfield, to try to put suspicion on yourself. Or two, use that obliviousness to your advantage. To where, honestly, it's better for them to lie if they don't know that you're the Renfield working for them. The key thing, though, when it comes to the villager's perspective, is that when it comes to the Renfield and the Master, is that they're going to be the two roles to watch out for, because they're both wasted kills for the village team. So, oftentimes, whenever somebody is suspicious of a player, they might offer the suggestion, and it's a viable one, of, is this a Master play? Is this a Renfield play? Are they trying to throw off suspicion here? It's entirely possible. So it's entirely up to you that's going to base the direction that you're going to go. Are you going to inform your vampire team? If you are able to secretly communicate with your vampire team, then maybe you might have more hands in being able to move the voting power towards you or towards your master. However, some players are crafty enough to where they're going to be able to catch that these players are working together. This one's cooperating this other player. Clearly, these guys are vampires. So that might not be the best idea. When it comes to roles to claim, you kind of want to go along the same route as the master, because you're trying to take the fall for the vampire team. Because unlike the other vampires, when it comes to the conditions, the Renfield himself is not a vampire. So if the Renfield dies, the vampire team can still win, including the Renfield. So that is something very important to keep in mind when it comes to boosting the vampire team and the overall way that you're going to play. Here's some extra community things that you might not even thought of as far as the angle that you're going to go with as the Renfield. Even though the Mark of the Bat is pretty useless in comparison to any of the other marks and doesn't really do anything, it actually provides great information for both sides of the conflict. Think about it this way. The Renfield gives himself the Mark of the Bat before he closes his eyes. If he no longer has the Mark of the Bat, you already know right out the gate that a priest cleansed you. And that's way more information than any other player has. Because pretty much you tell that the priest cleansed you, and any other role possibly could think that they just received no mark during the dusk phase, which is an entirely possible angle. You could have went to sleep with your Mark of Clarity at the beginning of the game, and then when you woke up and you saw your mark, and it was a Mark of Clarity again, that doesn't necessarily convince you that the priest did anything. So it could just be, hey, I woke up. Hey, I'm all clear. When that may have not been the case. If you were given the mark of vampire or fear, you will cleanse yourself of it, meaning you will not be able to be turned into a vampire. And again, remember, the Renfield isn't a vampire, so if he dies, the vampire team can still win. If a marksman, pickpocket, or gremlin decide to check you, and they find out that you have the Mark of the Bat, that is a problem. Because then they will automatically know that you're the Renfield because you have the one mark that nobody else has. And then, at that point, the pickpocket and the marksman will be able to immediately tell the village team, don't vote for this person. Don't listen to anything that they say. They're the Renfield. They don't need to die. The only way that you can possibly convince, and it's a very slim chance that you will be able to do so, if you can convince the marksman and the pickpocket that you didn't see any vampires when you woke up, that is the only way that you could potentially convince them that there's no vampires. I'm on the same team as you. And that's literally the only shot you have. And that's also just the main key thing that the village team has to be aware of. If the Renfield is telling the truth, and that there are no vampires in play, then he's a villager. He's a villager just like everybody else. Just like the pickpocket, just like the gremlin, just like the marksman, just like the priest, just like Cupid, the instigator, and diseased. They're all villagers. So if they kill the Renfield, then they've screwed themselves to the game. So that's the only sort of risk that you have when it comes to the Renfield as a whole. Because the information rolls altogether are very slim altogether. And you want to make yourself, again, look suspicious enough to receive the votes, but not enough to where players are debating, are you the Renfield or are you the Master? And being able to fight back against the marksman and the pickpocket.
So honestly, when it comes to One Night Ultimate Vampire, and you're talking specifically about the vampire team, they've got a lot of things going for them. With the Renfield and the Master serving as the protectors of the whole group, the Count and the Vampire can just work away at their bluffs in trying to convince the villagers that they aren't what they say that they are. Overall, the main roles to kind of watch out for that have the most information inside of One Night Ultimate Vampire are the marksman and the pickpocket, because the pickpocket can look at marks, and the marksman looks at a mark and a card. The copycat is also a slight risk, depending on if there is no vampires that he sees in the middle, and essentially becomes one of the villagers that isn't in play. But otherwise, hopefully all of this information is helpful to you inside of One Night Ultimate Vampire, and it'll also be most helpful to you when we get to the epic battles. Otherwise, I thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.